Second grade and if you don't pay attention, yeah, I was like, you want to she's okay, but I always have and then you this year it's and they did and the picture is small. That's already there. And they threw the ball back together. It's trying to get a nice job.
Oh, yeah. Play the play.
You the play is thing. In the channel, and they had a third in the shortstop. And it's just like, I like that, but he got, I did it with his right. It also And he had these. They already have his bill. So there's a. Well, and the rest of them, they're the outdoor. And why didn't they get some sense of this? Like any of and like, it's about the four, I think, next thing. And playing part of each girl. First year, the second grade, and so, where there I can hear some ability. Oh, I'm sure that. It's no fun. Yeah. Thank you.
The chairman of all, the copy of the, can be started now, since 2 minutes, Ecclesiastes.
We're doing, guys.
One holiday down, let me go. Oh. It's not, it's okay.
We're getting quiet down a little bit. We're going to start our Bible class this morning. We're working through the wisdom books. We spent a couple weeks in Proverbs. Last week off was Service Sunday, but today we're going to be starting with Ecclesiastes. And which, it's Mother's Day, so happy Mother's Day to everyone. And then we get to talk about the utility of life a little bit today on Mother's Day with Ecclesiastes. So in my defense, it was either Ecclesiastes or Job, which neither of which are very easy topic to start into on Mother's Day. But I think it should be a good discussion. What I want us to do to begin, just to get a little bit of the flavor of Ecclesiastes, if someone can open up to the beginning of Ecclesiastes and read it loud like you're reading the Word of God, I want to hear Ecclesiastes 1, verses 2 through 11.
And cannot, is not satisfied being, but the ear filled with hearing. What has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done. And there is nothing new under the sun. Is there a thing of which it is said, see, this is new, it has already been in the ages before us. There is no remembrance of former things, nor will there be any remembrance of later things yet to be among those who come in?
So there we have it, the opening salvo from Solomon here. The words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. How does that make you feel to hear how he starts this off and doesn't really hold back any punches about what things look like? Any thoughts about what you heard there, how it makes you feel, the opening tenor, the opening theme, the opening kind of feeling to this book? All things are full of weariness. Nice happy tone for Mother's Day again, right? Patty. So Patty's point out that this is pretty much what life is like without God. Well, I think to dig into this a little bit, Patty, I like that. That's where I'm going to be going here in just a minute. But I want to walk through a few things within what we're looking at within this book and some key themes kind of that Solomon's addressing here. And really with what Patty said, I mean, she's right in a way. Solomon's writing about this in a way that life viewed from an earthly perspective is utterly futile and meaningless. So I've got this word, it looks like Hebel, but it's actually Hevel, which is the Hebrew word here. And this is the Hebrew word here that gets translated, depending on which translation you have, it says vanity of vanities, all is vanity, or some will say meaninglessness, or meaningless. But really what he's using here, Hevel is a word that means like vapor or smoke. And if you think about water vapor, if you're boiling water and it's coming up off the top of the pot, or if you're thinking about smoke coming up off a fire, you can see it and it's definitely there, but you can't ever grab hold of it. You can't necessarily have it move it in some certain direction or do anything with it. I mean, certainly smoke could go up a chimney, but then it's going to go out the chimney and up into the sky and it's going to go over where it's going to go. And he's using this word hebel here as this vanity or this, this meaningless part of life, this vapor, this smoke that you can't hold on to, in a metaphorical sense to signify that, I mean, really the human condition. We live in a sinful, broken, fallen world. The human condition in this fallen world is insubstantial, it's fleeting, it's frustrating, and it's temporary. This word's often translated, like I said, to vanity, to signify the futility and meaningless state of human existence that Solomon sees like a vapor. Humans are often frustrated that there seems to be nothing permanent, nothing that you can really hold on to or grasp. If you're looking at the things of this world, it could be your job, it could be, some aspect of your family, it could be some aspect about whatever it is that you think you're going to do in life, whatever kind of plans you want to make, however smart you think you are, however wise you think you are, all these things about the world that you feel like you could try to hold on to. And Solomon's saying, I've seen all of it. I've been through all of it. And none of these things are things that you can truly ever hold on to or that are ever going to make life have meaning. Some experience of life are just not fair. They're unjust. The rain still falls on the wicked. Sometimes the wicked and the sinners seem like they're the ones that get ahead. Sometimes people we know die young and we talk about them being innocent and the way that seems unfair. But moreover, just as nothing can be done to, like I said, control that vapor. If you think about the steam coming up off the boiling water, you can't really control it. You can't grab it. You can't move it. You can't shape it. Eventually, it's just going to disperse in the air. He gets to this truth, but this painful truth. Death will bring all people to the same end. There's nothing you can hold on to. There's nothing that you can grasp in this world that's going to stop the inevitable march of time toward death. I'm going to jump around here a little bit because I've got time and death up here. There's a couple of the topics that he really dives into. In the early parts of the chapters, he's really just laying out some of the ways that there's the inevitable march of time. The inevitable march that each day we get older. The inevitable peace in the ways that it doesn't matter what you do. It doesn't matter how successful you are. It doesn't matter how wise you are. It doesn't matter how rich you are. Time will move forward. And time moves forward in a way that we have no control over. Time moves forward in a way that we can't do anything to stop it, to change it. And that time, as it moves forward, is eventually going to lead to the fact that the righteous and the wicked, everyone will perish. This broken, sinful world that we live in, death is the wages of sin. And death is what awaits all of us. And again, as I say all this is important to think that he's writing this from a worldly perspective, a secular perspective. If you're looking at the world in absence of God and his goodness and anything that God has done, this is how you're going to see the world. And this is the truth about what the world is, absent God and his goodness and his grace and his mercy. So I've got two other phrases, or three other, I guess. One of the phrases he uses a lot is under the sun. And he uses this in a way to talk about not everything that happens on earth, but everything that's going on earth in this worldly sense. The things that you toil after, the things that you work after, the things that you strive after. Everything that's going on in your life, the things that that happen to you that are good, the things that seemingly happen to you that are bad, whatever it happens to be, everything under the sun includes this aspect of the futility, the meaninglessness of life, the vapor that you're striving after that you can't hold on to. Everything's encompassed by this. An important qualifier about this, though, too, is the fact that he's not making the case that this includes everything on earth or certainly everything in heaven. God in his goodness and God in his mercy acts in a way that's outside of time, acts outside of even death itself. But again, this under the sun is encompassing everything that's going on in the world from a worldly perspective. Two others that I've got up here too, just sometimes he says chasing after the wind, sometimes he says striving after the wind. And again, it kind of fits with this theme or this idea that in the midst of life, in the midst of whatever we're trying to do, in the midst of whatever we're trying to accomplish, in the midst of whoever we think we are, however smart we are, however successful we are, that all the things of this life, that you're running after the wind, you're chasing after the wind. Against another metaphor to describe the way, I mean, you can't hold on to the wind, you can't see the wind, you can't tell which way it's going to blow. So happy stuff. I'm going to stop there. I do have God gives meaning up here, and I'll talk about that in a second, but what I'm saying makes sense outside of my head? What kind of questions do you have? What thoughts or comments come to mind when you think about Solomon writing this book? And at least we read these opening verses that give a picture of what this looks like, of all this meaninglessness, all this futility, all this striving, chasing after the wind, all the things under the sun, and the worldly perspective is just never going to bring you anything good. Comments, thoughts, questions from anyone? You can all talk at once, it's all right. All right.
I don't understand what he's saying. It's fantastic what he's saying. Oh, it's just fabulous.
Yeah, I agree that's fantastic, and I agree that his mind is certainly above ours, but above mine at least. I mean, you think about the fact that Solomon, his wish when God said, asked him for what he wanted, and he asked for wisdom, and God certainly gave him an abundance of wisdom. Yeah. Yep. I thought you were gonna say that he was mixing oil with his gas, but it wasn't a 2-cycle, so he had a pretty dirty carburetor, but. Lori. Likely thinking later. So I mean, you think about the arc of Solomon's life. It's a good question. So, early in his reign and rule as king, God gives him his wisdom that he asks for. And he says, I also give you all these other things, riches and wealth and power and glory and everything. And Solomon does all the work to get the temple built. But in the midst of doing so, he ends up basically making a bunch of trade agreements with folks up in north toward what is now Lebanon, where he gets a bunch of the cedar for the temple. But in the midst of doing this, he ends up having 300 wives, 700 concubines. He ends up using his wisdom in a very worldly way to grow the kingdom of Israel. Well, so I'll say this about it. I think there's two kind of perspectives or two interpretations I want to get to in a minute that kind of are going to answer this a little bit more. But I think the short answer is I think Solomon's writing this later in his life, because in a way you could say, with when I described him using his power and his wealth and his riches and his wisdom even to expand and grow the kingdom of Israel, but doing so kind of in a worldly way, he's not trusting in God in the way probably that he should through parts of his life. I mean, 300 wives, 700 concubines, that seems like a mess. But I don't know how I can remember all their names, let alone, but anyway. But I think this is later in his life where he's really reflecting. Where he's really reflecting on the path of his life and where he's turning back to God in a way of recognizing through, because there's language that he'll use in Ecclesiastes of kind of basically, I've seen it all, I've done it all, I've had it all. So he's describing, I mean, he was a great king. He was a wealthy king. He built the temple. He did all these things. He's saying, I've done all these things. I've seen it all. I have all the wisdom. And I'm describing it in this way to paint a picture of none of it matters. And the none of it matters, again, is the worldly perspective. The none of it matters unless you have God. And that's what's really interwoven in the midst of all these really bleak passages like we read in chapter 1, is that none of it matters if you're just looking at it from a worldly perspective, but God does give meaning. Well, see, God gives meaning with 300 wives and 700 concubines. I thinking about the trials you might go through and the ways that God forms and shapes or refines like fire. I'm sure there might have been a few of those. Spawn, you got your hand up. Nope. Nope. Yep. No, I think that's a really good point because I've got a few verses I'm going to read here in a second. And I mean, he's looking at it from the long view. He's looking at the fact that God's judgment's going to come one day. He's thinking toward the end. And, if you're running after, like Vaughn was saying, all the money you have, you can't take it with you, or all the things you might have done, a few generations won't remember you. But God will know and God will remember. And at that judgment day, he's going to judge the righteous and the wicked alike. And in that sense, the meaning of life then that God gives has to do with that there's something beyond this life. There's even, so here's a few that I can read quickly. Yep. Well, and I think it's a really good point that we see so much in our society, and really, it's Jeremiah 31 that talks about God writing his law in our hearts when he does a new thing in the new covenant. And, knowing that the law of God is written on our hearts as people, and they're struggling and they're wrestling with their existential existence, their existence of life, but they're still working in a secular or worldly way of how can I make myself be a good person? How can I make myself be valued? How can I make myself, whatever my identity is, it's still in worldly things. And that's, really helpful, as Krista said, to look at these things and what they can tell us even about how we're potentially talking to somebody or how we're looking at somebody in our world today. Judy. Yeah.
That his heart is not right.
Yeah.
So he doesn't have.
Or I think at least that you're seeing some of the wrestle as maybe his heart's turning back toward God, but he's maybe not all the way there yet, or he's mostly there or partway there. I don't know exactly how far. That's between him and God, but there's the wrestling and the struggle going on. So here's a few verses, and then I want to get into these two perspectives or interpret. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Yeah. Doris. Now, yeah, I think life does. I mean, a phrase I've heard before sometimes is knowledge is a burden. Think about it. If you didn't even know that somebody was sick, that was, a distant friend or a distant relative, you don't know about it, the ignorance in a way is bliss, but is when you know about it, maybe it makes your heart feel heavy that you know something. And think about all the things that Solomon knew because of the wisdom God had given him and the ways that that might be a burden for him. So I'm going to read Ecclesiastes 2:24 and 25, and this is glimpses that he gives that are kind of interwoven within the scriptures or within Ecclesiastes here that show kind of this wrestling, but that the God is the one that gives meaning. There's nothing better for a person than he should eat and drink and find enjoyment in his toil. This also I saw is from the hand of God. For apart from him, who can eat or who can have an enjoyment? Ecclesiastes 7:13, consider the work of God. Who can make straight what he has made crooked? Or even Ecclesiastes 8:12, though a sinner does evil 100 times and prolongs his life, yet I know that it will be well for those who fear God because they fear before him. Fear of the Lord is one of the things we talked about in Proverbs. And I think here Solomon's writing about it in a way of recognizing within this life and within even his admonition or his critique or criticism of a worldly perspective, those who have the fear of the Lord, when he says there's something more to this life than just this life, the fear of the Lord is even painting in a way that where you can have hope. God will give meaning through condemnation. God will give meaning, in his judgment over evil at the last day. But God will also give meaning for those that fear him, that those that have their faith and trust in him, as they're judged as righteous before him because they fear the Lord. And think about what that means in the midst of the futility of everything that life is from a worldly perspective, the hope that's interwoven in this, that even though all of this life is vapor and you can't hold on to it and none of it really matters, it only doesn't matter in the sense of the fact that one day God, Jesus Christ himself, will be coming again to judge us. And for those of us that fear and trust and believe in Jesus Christ, that day will be a good day. Yes, go ahead. Yep. Yeah. So I think I'd answer it this way. Oh, yeah. So what's the difference between having fear of the Lord, where you might have guilt or shame, maybe something like that, as you stand before God, versus fear that's more about kind of the trust in the Lord, the way that Solomon's talking about it here. And if I could too, you're sharing a little bit about Jesse, your dad, at least about converting from Catholicism to Lutheranism and some of the families struggling with that conversion, the transferring over different churches. And, how do you feel certain before the Lord, maybe to say it that way? When the word fear gets used in the Bible, it gets used in a couple different ways. And we talked about this with Proverbs briefly, but there's that fear of Isaiah 6 when he's right there in front of God and he's truly afraid. Woe is me, I'm a man of unclean lips. How can I stand in the presence of God? Or the fear of the fear that's before Mary or Joseph when the angels come to see them, that kind of fear where you're really trembling. And there, Isaiah, even it's guilt. He's recognizing that he's a sinner. I can't stand in the presence of an almighty, holy, righteous, just God. The fear that Solomon's talking about here, the way I talked about it with Proverbs a little bit, is almost more like, where is your mind? Where is your heart? What's your orientation towards things in life? And that the fear of the Lord then is your orientation of turning towards God, knowing that you need his help, knowing that he is the one that gives you anything that's good, knowing that it's by his love, by his mercy, by his grace in Jesus Christ, that you're able to be forgiven, that you're able to put your faith and trust in him, to know that this life is not the end, all those kinds of things. And so this kind of fear in the Lord, there is no guilt, there is no shame, because you know you're forgiven, you know that you're redeemed. But you still then turn to God and say, thanks be to you for everything that you've done for me. I recognize that you are the author and perfecter of life. You're the author and the perfecter of faith that you've given me. You deserve all my honor, all the praise, all the thanksgiving, all the glory, etc., etc. And then in each moment of life, even the difficult times where we wander off on our own, that you turn back, and that orientation again to turn back and again seek God's grace and mercy and forgiveness, again seek his help. So let's move to this. And I kind of like this to think about a little bit. Two kind of options to think about, interpretations or perspectives about Solomon as he writes this. Like I said, it's pretty likely that he wrote this toward the end of his life. And the first one's been the way that we've been talking about a little bit, that it's almost kind of like a confession of his. That as Solomon's wrestling with everything that he's seen in his life, Solomon's wrestling with all the, difficulties, all the good, all the wealth that he's had, all the wisdom that he's had, the power that he's had as king, and his honesty then about through all of it of saying, I've seen it all, I've had it all, etc., and recognizing kind of the futility of all of it if you don't have God and you're not fearing God. That's one kind of perspective. The second one, at least, is this notion of, and I was reading about this week and I like it. I'm not saying that I think it's right. I just think it's interesting to think through that if he's toward the end of his life and he is turning back to God, even as his heart had turned away from God in the ways that he was living as king and not living righteously in the way that he should have, again, 300 wives, 700 concubines, all those kinds of things. But I've got this quote here that Solomon writes kind of from a concealed premise. And his book in reality is a work, kind of an apologetic work. An apologetic would be kind of, I'm making a case, I'm making an argument, I'm putting before this, for the world, the people around me to consider, what do you think of these things? But I'm making this case that I think I'm right, and I want you to consider and look at these things in this way. So this apparent worldliness is dictated by its aim. Solomon is addressing the general public whose view is just bounded by the horizons of this world. So he's meeting people that have a worldly perspective on their own ground, their own terms. I'm looking around at the world and I see all these people that are running after everything and they're not fearing God. Well, let's talk about what that really looks like. Let's talk about that philosophy and what it's really going to mean for you if you're just chasing or striving after the wind, or you're trying to grab hold of this vapor, this vanity of life. So he's meeting them on their own ground and proceeds to convict them of this inherent notion of this worldliness and its meaninglessness. His book then, in this idea, is in fact a critique of secularism. And even to call it this, the secularism, a secularized religion. We simply see this in our world today. It could be the secularized religion of science. And then we're going to look at science to explain the origin of all things, or look to just materialism and the ways that how atoms and everything come together, and that's how we're going to make sense of the world. Or a whole number of other things we could list off in our culture and society today. But the idea that Solomon is writing directly to people that are looking at the world this way, to push really hard against them, to say what you're doing doesn't make sense, it doesn't work, it's going to be meaningless. It is meaningless. So throughout the book, he shocks us into seeing life and death strictly from this ground level, this worldly perspective, and reaching the only conclusions that standpoint, if you're honest, will allow. But I like this. If he's writing this from this perspective, he's leading rather than just driving us. And here's what I think this means. That there's still hope interwoven into the midst of this meaninglessness of life. There's the hope of what is available there for you if you fear the Lord. and trust in the Lord and know that there is something after this life. And God gives meaning to this life. So leading you to hopefully to see that and turn away from the worldliness and turn to God rather than just driving you into despair. Rick.
Here.
Yep. I'm having so much fun today, right? Yeah. Yep. Well, it's so the fancy term for what you're talking about is ministerial versus magisterial gifts of God. Let me define that for you really quick, but the magisterial gifts of God are the things that come from him that are they're his grace, his mercy, his forgiveness, the salvation that he gives you and I, the things that are so far above us that there's absolutely nothing that we can eat. There's 0% that we even participated in at all. It's entirely by his grace that we are forgiven and redeemed in Jesus Christ. It's entirely by his grace that he sent his son to die and rise again to give us new life. Those are the magisterial gifts of God, but the ministerial gifts of God, think about the gifts that you have, that you're given by the Holy Spirit to walk and serve as his hands and feet. The hands and feet of God as we live as the witnesses of who Jesus Christ is, the good news that we know, that even if you're dealing with the idiot clients that you're trying to deal with on a day, you're living your life in the fear and the trust of Jesus Christ and those gifts that he's given you. He gave you a smart mind to be an engineer. He gave you a listening ear to listen to someone when they're struggling. Whatever it is, the gifts that you've been given, but the importance that ministerial gifts, those gifts we've been given, are always secondary to the magisterial gifts of God, his grace, his mercy, his forgiveness, his salvation. And we should never get them flipped around that somehow the things I'm doing in this life as God works through me are somehow more important, or they're going to be above the gift of Jesus Christ himself. And there's a beauty of the fact that we live as his church. To see the vanities of this life and to see the worldly perspectives of those we see around us. But even as Solomon talks about that, I like this to say it this way. He bids us to set our hearts not on earthly vanities, but on the Creator himself, on Jesus Christ, to even say it that way for us. Solomon isn't explicitly talking about Jesus here. He's talking about more about the Creator. And we can gladly then and responsibly, in a responsible way, accept life as it comes to us. Accept life within the vocations that we have, accept life in the midst of even the struggles that we have, knowing that in part they're all temporary. They are all like a chasing after the wind, other than the ways that we're turning to seek after God. We're turning to him to look to see how is he at work through us in whatever station of life you might be, where then the Holy Spirit's the one enabling you to do good things in this life. Stu, yeah. Keep the main thing, yeah. I think it's a really good question. I don't know if everybody heard Stu, but keep the main thing. The main thing is this book directed at those people who don't know what the main thing is. don't know God, don't know Jesus Christ in our context? Or is it directed at people that do know, or maybe should know, but they're not really keeping the main thing the main thing? Both, Patty says. I think the answer is yes. Think about how useful this could be if you're talking to somebody that's living in there, and let's say that they're living with some aspect of secularized religion. They're relying on science and evolution and everything about cosmology and whatever else to explain the origin of the universe and why we are here, what they are here, and they're an atheist. I think that there's words in here that could give really good rebuke and critique, but also shed light on what that really looks like to live your life in the absence of God. I think also for, maybe it's for each of us here, for all of us as Christians, how often do we get caught into the trap of looking at the things of this world? Looking at how proud we are as, it's Mother's Day, but I'm going to speak as a father of, am I proud of all the things that my kids do? Most of them, most of the things they do, right? But do I get too caught up into being a dad and what I think is important and about feeling validated as a dad, that somehow becomes more important than I'm a child of Jesus Christ, and I'm a child of God, and I get those flipped around? Or about my job, or about some other aspect of your life. Let's say it's financial security, and you're looking at your 401k and the ebbs and flows of that. And this becomes in a way a first commandment issue. You look at the things of the world and the things of life, and you're putting your trust into those or your trust into your sense of being able to control those. And Solomon would say here, you have no control over them at all. God has control over them. You need to turn and put your trust and faith and your fear in him, knowing that he's going to provide for you each and every day. Well, we've got a few more minutes. I want to try this. We're going to read some more really happy verses here this morning. So turn to Ecclesiastes 9. I'm just going to go ahead and read it for us because we've got 6 minutes. So this is chapter 9, verses 7 through 10. Go, eat your bread with joy, drink your wine with a merry heart, for God has already approved what you do. Let your garments be always white, let not oil be lacking on your head. Enjoy life with the wife whom you love all the days of your vain life that he has given you under the sun, because that is your portion in life, in your toil at which you toil under the sun. Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with your might, for there is no work or thought or knowledge or wisdom in Sheol to which you are going. I've got 2 questions up here, but what do these verses say about time, life, death, perspective Solomon's giving? I've got 3 questions. Which interpretation seems to fit better, either Solomon's own wrestling with his own wisdom, or the idea that he's putting this out there as for the public that's stuck in the world to read? This basic notion that he's saying, go live your life, do it, but you're all going to die. Some happy thoughts. Yeah. Let me ask it this way. Which perspective of the two do you think Solomon's right in here, that he's wrestling with his own struggle and his own attempt to kind of crawl back to God and all the wisdom and power and glory and everything that he had as king? Or do you think he's more right in this as kind of a rebuke or a criticism of just the world and for people in the world to read? Yes, I mean, I think it could be either one. I just think it's interesting to think through what that might mean in terms of how we use it and talk about it. gonna happen to me, it's gonna happen to everybody else. And the words are kind of harsh, if we're honest. He's pretty blunt, he doesn't hold back. And again, he's setting this up. I mean, I like both ideas of the interpretations, the perspectives. Either just his own recognition of, I ran after all of it. I was king. I built the temple. I had all these riches. I had all this glory. I had all this power. I'm sitting here toward the end of my life realizing that it doesn't matter. None of it matters if you don't have God. Or even then to look at the world and he sees the way the world works and he sees all these people running after all these things. And he's just saying, again, all these things that you think you're going to try to do, what does it matter if you don't have God? It doesn't. Ellery.
No, because you're really brilliant in the things that you're good at, where you gotta do this kind of stuff. It is a different front.
Oh, yeah.
What a brilliant mission when you get to the process, right? Understanding when your grinder goes in, what does it mean? You're hearing things that, and I'm experiencing that at this age, you know, all the things that the windows are not as clean as they used to be. Or why are the birds stop singing? Still singing, they're just sitting here making it work. Fabulous stuff. Go ahead and read it if you haven't read it.
Yeah. Two.
Ephesians 2:10 talks about the works that God's prepared for us, and to me, part of this is saying, go forth, and conquer, do those works, because when you're dead, you can't do them.
Absolutely. And there's even pieces of that that are intermixed within Ecclesiastes where he's talking about, you know, even if I read it again, Ecclesiastes 2 again, there's nothing better for a person that he should eat and drink and find enjoyment in his toil. You know, his toil is work. Stu's talking about the works that God has prepared beforehand that we should walk in them from Ephesians 2:10. Because this also I saw is from the hand of God, for apart from him, who can eat or have enjoyment? So even in the midst of this life, recognizing that the work that you do, the toil that you do, all those things are things that God's prepared before you. How am I going to live today? Am I going to live running after the things of the world, of being so focused on the things of the world that I lose sight of God and his goodness and his mercy and the ways that he's working through me? Or am I going to live each day looking for the fact that I have joy, first and foremost, in the salvation that we have in Jesus Christ? I know that I am his. I know that you are redeemed. You know that this life is not the end. So I live today. I'm gonna enjoy life today. Because God is the one in control. God is the one who gives me the goodness. God is the one that's saying, here's the work I have for you to do today. Carol. So it's the interesting mix of, it's a blessing to have many years on this in this life and enjoy all of them, but they're still vanity. Fun. Yeah. Nope. If you did see a hearse pulling a U-Haul, you'd wonder who in the world that was and what they thought was coming for them, but yeah. And it's all temporary. I mean, yes. Who by worrying can add a single hour to the span of your life? Lori, you had your hand up too. Well, isn't it a song? The birds? I thought it was the birds. I could be wrong. Somebody look it up. It's the birds. All right, well, we're a couple minutes over. Next week, we're gonna maybe have some fun a little bit. There's 5 different toils that Solomon talks about in Ecclesiastes. I want to dig into those a little bit, and we'll spend a little time with those. We'll see you next week as we look at Ecclesiastes again.